Agent Kael Voss flicked the remains of his cigarette into the sterile corridors of the Orion Intelligence Bureau, a brazen act that hardly surprised any of the staff who had grown accustomed to his abrasive style. A cleaning drone, an oval-shaped device with dozens of tiny suction ports, whirred forward and intercepted the smoldering stub midair, disposing of it in a silent demonstration of mechanical efficiency. Kael watched this small spectacle with cool detachment, then turned his gaze to the far end of the corridor, where Director Liss's hologram flickered into existence. "Voss," the director said, her voice precise, calm, and tinged with a ghostly echo that always accompanied the Bureau's telepresence systems. "We have a situation." Kael exhaled slowly, his breath trailing faint wisps of tension. "Isn't there always?" Director Liss's translucent figure shimmered, her imposing features bending with the holographic feed. "The Phantom has resurfaced," she stated, and the corridor lights dimmed in response to a command from her personal console. A sweeping star map materialized, its edges drifting beyond Kael's field of vision. Swirls of cosmic dust, star clusters, and shimmering galaxies danced before him, until they zoomed onto 3 specific points, each one a blinking crimson circle. 3 quantum vaults, she continued, gesturing with a half-luminous finger. All high-level security repositories. All have been breached. Curiously, each infiltration was marked by a single violet flower, placed near the console that had been tampered with. Kael's eyes narrowed. He had read the old case files about the Phantom, a rogue infiltrator reputed to slip through the tightest security net like a specter. "And all these points lead to Cronus 7, he said in a low tone, recalling how that obscure planet was rumored to be quarantined due to dangerous anomalies. More than once, contradictory reports had described Cronus 7 as both a barren wasteland and a labyrinth of swirling timescapes. He kept these incongruous remarks to himself. "Precisely," Director Liss said. "Cronus 7 is locked down under the oldest quarantines in the Orion sector, established centuries ago, even before the Bureau existed as it does now. There is an ancient prisoner there, some woman named Seris Aelara, though official records are patchy and not many agents are briefed on the details." Kael tilted his head. Why so much secrecy over a single prisoner? Liss's hologram shimmered, revealing a tautness in her posture. "Because she's rumored to be the last living link to a catastrophic event in the timeline. Our archives say she was bound for centuries, imprisoned by the earliest guardians of cosmic stability. She's a paradox herself, a living anomaly, or so they say. If the Phantom is meddling with Cronus 7, we have to assume something far more significant is at stake than a conventional jailbreak." Kael's mouth pressed into a thin line. "I'm on it," he said, turning on his heel and ignoring the dozen camera eyes that watched his every step. If the Phantom was truly as capable as the legends claimed, this mission was bound to be more complicated than any he had faced. He boarded the sleek infiltration craft, the Aethelia, with minimal fanfare. Its hull glistened in the docking bay's artificial light, tinted a reflective silver. Once inside, Kael settled into the cockpit, letting the subdued hum of the ship's power cores soothe his nerves. The Bureau's automated clearance protocols guided him through the enormous space gate, where a swirl of hyperlight parted to reveal the labyrinthine paths of faster-than-light travel. Through the forward viewport, brilliant colors arced across the void, streams of prismatic light indicating slipstream channels. He initiated jump sequences, feeling the gravitational shift. Then, with a silent flash, the Aethelia vanished into the swirling domain of hyperspace. During the journey, Kael reviewed the old intelligence on the Phantom. This mysterious figure had never been conclusively identified, and the only consistent detail linking the infiltration events was the calling card, a single violet flower. Strange references in the Bureau's archives recounted that, on rare occasions, the Phantom seemed to strike at random. But those who dove deeper found a subtle pattern, a hidden logic that always pointed to disruptions in the timeline, to quantum anomalies, or to technology deemed too dangerous for mainstream use. At Cronus 7, the Aethelia emerged in a halo of disrupted starlight, decelerating near the perimeter of the ancient quarantine field. This field, which manifested as a swirling barrier of crackling purple-blue energy, repelled or destroyed ships lacking the correct access codes. Kael punched in the codes Director Liss had given him. For a tense moment, the swirling barrier resisted. Then, with a stately slowness, it parted, allowing the craft to pass through. The planet's surface rolled into view, an expanse of dusky plains and labyrinthine canyons. Jagged mountains crowned with dark storms loomed on the horizon. Great rifts in the ground revealed glowing veins of time-scarred energy that radiated an eerie luminescence. There were no welcoming spires, no spaceports, no visible infrastructure of any kind. This was a planet left to fester in whatever unnatural condition had befallen it eons ago. Kael performed a scan and found faint energy readings near the southern hemisphere. He guided the Aethalia down into a craggy valley, enveloped by the battered remains of centuries-old architecture, broken columns, collapsed temples, and rubble as far as the eye could see. His landing gear extended onto a flat section of stone, etched with strange runes. The hull hissed as the ship's systems adjusted to the planet's thin, chilling atmosphere. Stepping onto the surface, Kael immediately sensed a subtle disorientation. The air tasted stale, and the gravity felt ever so slightly off, as if the planet itself wavered in a half-remembered dream. He activated his integral chronovisor, a device strapped over one of his eyes that could gauge temporal irregularities. The readings went haywire, a flickering array of contradictory data. Cronus 7 was indeed steeped in a time warp. Each breath Kael took left him feeling as though he were walking through echoes of 1,000 different epochs. He advanced through the desolate ruins, scanning for signs of infiltration. An old corridor, half buried by debris, led into darkness. Holding a small plasma torch, he trudged deeper, passing what looked to be murals carved into the walls. Some depicted figures in flowing robes, brandishing staffs or scepters, all culminating around a central figure. Female, tall, draped in regal attire, with eyes that radiated an otherworldly glow. Below each depiction of her face, Kael spotted the outline of a chain coiled around her wrists or ankles, as though she had been shackled since time immemorial. The corridor eventually led to a yawning chamber, circular in design. The remains of tall pillars stood cracked and broken, their surfaces inscribed with archaic script. At the center rose a dais, topped by a stand made of glimmering crystal. There, to Kael's astonishment, lay a single violet flower, a fresh, living blossom in this place of ruin. Kneeling by the flower, he recognized the Phantom's calling card. Thin motes of shimmering energy drifted in the air, reminiscent of stardust. Kael ran his fingers lightly over the dusty surface of the dais, feeling strange vibrations, as if the entire structure pulsed with dormant power. A trail of footprints led away from the dais, crossing the chamber to a massive set of vault-like doors carved into the far wall. The doors were engraved with swirling patterns reminiscent of galactic spirals, each coil inlaid with tarnished metal. By the door's base lay a cluster of shattered locks and an arcane mechanism severed by some advanced cutting tool. The Phantom had clearly passed through here. Kael braced himself, placed a palm against the cold surface, and with a grunt, pushed the heavy panel open. Beyond the threshold, a short corridor opened up into another chamber, this one enveloped in a faint, pulsing radiance, as though the space possessed its own luminescence. Stepping in, Kael froze at the sight. A towering cylinder, seemingly made of swirling, semi-transparent energy, stood at the center. Within it, suspended as if in watery stasis, was a woman. She looked as though she were caught mid-breath, her raven-black hair flowing upward in weightless strands, her arms outstretched. Around her wrists and ankles were metallic shackles studded with intricate runes. Her face, serene yet regal, bore an expression of quiet determination, as if her spirit refused to surrender. Even through the swirling barrier, Kael could see faint scars, lines of ancient torment etched into her skin. Tiny arcs of crackling energy snaked across her body, hinting at the power the cylinder harnessed to keep her immobile. He took a moment to gather his thoughts. This must be Seris Aelara, the prisoner rumored to have been bound for centuries, maybe even millennia. In the corner of his eye, he caught movement. A fleeting shadow darted along the chamber's perimeter, vanishing behind a tall console. Kael tensed, hand drifting towards his sidearm. But before he could draw, A voice echoed across the chamber, a low, almost hypnotic whisper. "You've come to witness the final unraveling, have you not?" The words emanated from a slender figure who emerged from behind the console. He wore a simple black tunic, boots that glided silently over the floor, and a half-mask that concealed everything but his piercing eyes. Clutched in his left hand was another violet flower. "The Phantom, I presume," Kael said, keeping his tone steady. Though the figure's silhouette matched no known identity from the Bureau's files, the flower and his infiltration skill left little doubt. "Yes," the Phantom murmured. "I've traveled far and risked much to be here." "And so have you, Agent Kael Voss." Kael's mind raced. How did the Phantom know his name? He kept his stance firm, though an unease coiled in his stomach. Why breach the vaults? Why sabotage the Bureau's intelligence network? Why come here, to this cursed world, he demanded. The Phantom tilted his head. "Because the threads of time are fraying, and Seris Aelara is our only hope to mend them. Her imprisonment is the cause of the distortion you see around you, these swirling anomalies that plague the timeline. No matter what you've been told, she is no monstrous criminal. She was a guardian once, a protector of the cosmic continuum. Those who bound her centuries ago feared her power. They twisted the story so the galaxy would believe she was the villain. But the truth is more complex." Kael's chronovisor flickered with renewed disorientation, the readout fusing random dates and eras with no coherence. The entire planet vibrated with an unstable temporal wave. "If you claim to be saving us, how do you explain the chaos your intrusions caused?" he asked, voice echoing. "I needed the ancient keystones," the Phantom answered, extending his free hand to reveal a set of shimmering crystalline shards. Each quantum vault contained one. They're the only devices capable of disabling her stasis field. The legends say only when Seris is freed can we realign the fractured timeline. But there's a risk, he added, his tone subdued. If done incorrectly, the entire region of space-time might collapse, unleashing paradoxes far beyond Cronus 7. We would witness cataclysmic chain reactions in every known century. Kael clenched his jaw. The Bureau's official stance was that Seris Aelara was a threat that had to remain imprisoned. Yet the Phantom's earnestness caused him to hesitate. Was it possible they had been told a partial truth, or even an outright lie? He glanced again at Seris, hovering in the swirling energy. Her face radiated a strange mix of sorrow and resilience. If there's truly a cataclysm at stake, the Bureau's records must have indicated it, Kael said. Why would the directors keep it hidden? Because they inherited the original condemnation of Seris, the Phantom replied, stepping closer to the stasis cylinder. The earliest Guardians, the Forerunners, believed that Seris's powers were too dangerous. She can manipulate the flow of time at will, and her empathy extends across centuries. They couldn't understand her gift, so they labeled her an abomination. Instead of letting her guide them, they imprisoned her. Over generations, the truth morphed into an unquestioned dogma. Seris Aelara must never be freed. Kael felt a sudden spike in the temporal field, the air around him seeming to shimmer. Perhaps a breach in the planet's labyrinthine timeline had opened. If she's truly some lost guardian, he said, then how do we free her safely? The Phantom placed the violet flower atop a crystalline panel near the cylinder. I've spent decades tracing her legend, collecting knowledge from scattered star systems. These keystones, he brandished the shards, fit into the core of the stasis generator. Once aligned, they disrupt the bindings around Seris, but they must be positioned in precisely the right sequence. One error, and we might rip open a rift in the continuum. He moved with careful deliberation to an adjacent console bristling with archaic levers and glowing glyphs. Each glyph pulsed with color. Without warning, the console crackled, sending sparks arcing across the chamber. Kael heard a distant rumbling, like thunder echoing through time itself. Hurry, Kael said, half surprised at his own urgency. The planet feels like it's about to tear itself apart. The Phantom nodded, gently inserting the first shard into a narrow slot in the console's surface. A cacophony of mechanical sounds filled the air, followed by the shifting hum of layered energies. The swirling barrier around Seris flickered, revealing glimpses of her face, her eyes fluttering as though on the cusp of waking. With cautious precision, the Phantom inserted the second shard, then the third. Suddenly, The stasis field glowed with brilliant intensity. Runes etched on the shackles around Seris's limbs ignited in pale white fire, as if they were fighting back. A jolt of energy blasted outward, sending Kael stumbling, while the Phantom maintained his stance, bracing against the console. "Keep going," Kael shouted over the deafening hum. The Phantom retrieved the final shard, hesitated for a fraction of a second, then slid it into the last slot. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a roar like 1,000 storms, the cylinder imploded in on itself, pulling swirling energies inward before they collapsed in a blinding flash. Kael shielded his eyes. When he lowered his arm, Seris Aelara floated gently to the chamber floor, free of the stasis prison. She took a shuddering breath, her chains still attached, but their runes fading. Her eyes opened slowly, revealing irises that glimmered with cosmic fire. She swayed slightly, as if learning to stand again after an eternity of stillness. The Phantom stepped forward, extending a hand, but before he could speak, a thundering crack resonated from above. The ceiling tore open, revealing a swirling vortex of pulsing light, blue, pink, violet, and green, all merging into a dreadful funnel of temporal chaos. Loose stones and shards of metal lifted into the air, spinning around them in a frantic dance. The ground trembled so fiercely that cracks snaked through the chamber's floor, releasing bursts of time-laced energy. Kael's chronovisor beeped uncontrollably, the readouts cycling through random epochs. Seris let out a groan of anguish, raising her bound wrists to the vortex. Her voice, melodic yet commanding, reverberated with layers, as though countless versions of her spoke in unison. "The shackles remain, binding my power, fueling the storm," she said, eyes flickering with golden light. "If they are not removed, the planet's temporal field will unravel entirely." "Stand back," Kael said, his tone urgent. Drawing his sidearm, he aimed at the shackles, uncertain whether his bureau-grade plasma rounds would do anything. But before he could pull the trigger, the Phantom grabbed his wrist gently. "That won't work," the Phantom said. "The shackles were forged with archaic runic science. Plasma will only charge them further." He turned to Seris. "We have the keystones, but the runes on your shackles remain. Can you break them from within?" Seris closed her eyes, breathing in the swirling chaos. Her hair drifted around her in the vortex's gale, her expression one of intense concentration. An ethereal glow shimmered around her chains, but the runes flared in resistance, spitting arcs of white flame. She gasped, falling to one knee. "I can't," she managed, "not alone." "Then let me help," Kael said unexpectedly, surprising even himself. Something about her plea resonated in him. Perhaps it was the battered look in her eyes, or perhaps the sense of universal peril overshadowed any bureaucratic directive. He strode forward, kneeling beside her. "Tell me what to do." She looked at him with an expression that blended gratitude and sorrow. "Place your hand on the runes," she said, voice trembling under the vortex's roar. "Will it to crumble? Lend me your resolve." Without further hesitation, Kael pressed his palm against the white-hot runes on one of the shackles. Instantly, pain lanced through his arm. It was as if raw cosmic energy raced through every nerve in his body, revealing fleeting visions of battles lost to time, of civilizations rising and falling, of swirling galaxies. Through the shock, he sensed Seris's presence, a guiding warmth amid the tumult. As their minds interconnected, the runes on the shackle began to dim, their glow receding. The metal cracked, letting out a piercing shriek. Kael grit his teeth, focusing on the image of the runes shattering, of setting her free. The Phantom, kneeling on Seris's other side, pressed his hand against the second shackle. With a shared focus, they poured their combined will into severing the ancient fetters. The swirl of cosmic energies intensified to a fever pitch, the vortex overhead screeching with building fury. Finally, with a thunderous snap, one shackle broke apart, dissolving into fragments of swirling light that disintegrated before they hit the ground. A second later, the other shackle followed suit. Freed from those oppressive bonds, Seris rose, arcs of golden energy spiraling around her form. For a fraction of a moment, Kael could do nothing but stare. Seris radiated an ancient majesty, her eyes reflecting eons of hidden knowledge. She lifted her hands toward the raging vortex in the ceiling. "The storm is upon us," she said quietly, "but perhaps it is not too late." With that, she cast her gaze upward, channeling the brilliant aura around her. As though commanded by her will, the swirling funnel of destructive energy paused, quivering in place. A wave of golden light erupted from her hands, forming a barrier of luminescence that rose to meet the vortex. Shards of temporal distortion, spiraling debris, and raw cosmic fury clashed against this dome of protection. The entire chamber glowed in a radiant conflagration of contending forces. Outside, Kael could hear distant explosions echo through the labyrinth of ruins, as though the planet itself buckled under the stress. Lightning raked across the roiling sky, illuminating the tumbled architecture that once formed an ancient civilization. Gradually, though, the swirling maelstrom overhead began to recede, drawn inward by the calming presence Seris projected. When it finally subsided, the ceiling returned to its broken but stable state, and the swirling energies that had threatened to devour reality collapsed into a sphere of glowing mist that circled Seris, gently drifting like cosmic fireflies. The planet ceased its trembling, the cracks in the ground stilled, and the hush of an immense stillness fell upon the chamber. Kael let out a long, ragged breath, his heart pounding. Next to him, the phantom lowered his head, as if in reverence. Seris lowered her arms. She turned to them with a soft smile, exhaustion evident in her eyes. "You have my eternal gratitude," she said. "I've waited countless centuries for someone to believe the truth. My captors, convinced of my danger, never realized that confining me here, trapping my power, would eventually unravel the timeline." Kael shook his head in disbelief. "All those years we believed you were a threat," he said, voice low. "We had no idea the threat was leaving you chained." Seris offered him a gentle nod, her expression tinged with sadness and empathy. "History is made by those who triumph, and the earliest guardians triumphed by locking me away. Their fear shaped the accounts that followed. In time, no one questioned the tale, and I remained sealed." The phantom stepped forward, removing his half-mask at last. His features were young, yet lined with a certain weariness, as though he had lived several lifetimes. A faint scar stretched across his cheek. He bowed slightly to Seris. "I've lived for this moment," he said simply. "The Bureau called me an outlaw, a ghost, but I did only what was necessary to gather the keystones. He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I only hope this is enough to mend what's been broken." Seris looked at him kindly. "Your efforts have not been in vain. The timeline is healing, though we must tread carefully. The echoes of centuries of disruption won't fade in an instant." Kael's chronovisor now showed stable readings. No more wild fluctuations, no jumbled dates. It seemed the planet's time warp had receded. Yet, as he cast his gaze around the ancient chamber, noting the fractured pillars and the swirling lights still drifting in the air, he wondered if the Bureau would accept this new truth or continue to cling to the old illusions. "Then, what happens now?" Kael asked, turning to Seris. She surveyed the battered structure, the fading lines of archaic script on the walls, and the silent console that once imprisoned her. A solemn dignity underpinned her voice. "I will remain here, at least for a while, to guide the planetary energies back to equilibrium. Cronus, 7 must be restored. The prison that held me for ages was also entwined with the planet's core. If left untended, the fractures could reemerge, and the vortex could return. Let me help," the phantom offered, stepping closer. "I've studied these runes for years, learned to manipulate them. If you'll teach me, perhaps my knowledge can hasten the planet's recovery." Kael folded his arms, a part of him surprised at the phantom's humility. But after what they had just endured, it was understandable. "And the Bureau?" he asked aloud. "I was sent here on a mission to apprehend you." He gestured to the phantom. "And to ensure Seris remains confined. Now, I have every reason to do the opposite. How do I reconcile that?" Seris lifted her gaze to Kael. "Only you can decide. You've seen the truth. The Bureau, or at least some of its members, may not understand. Perhaps they'll see reason, or perhaps they'll brand you a traitor." Kael exhaled heavily, recalling Director Lys's stern face. "Lys isn't cruel. She's bound by the protocols handed down through centuries. Maybe, in time, she'll accept that Seris was never the threat they believed." A sudden subtle rumble in the distance reminded them that the planet was still unstable. Broken columns teetered, dust drifting from the high ceiling. Seris pressed her palms to the ground, channeling a warm wave of golden energy outward, like ripples in a pond. With each ripple, the trembling quieted. The phantom brushed dust from his tunic. Cronus 7's temporal field has slowed its collapse, but we'll need to realign its energy conduits. That means traveling to the old spires scattered across the planet's surface. Each spire holds a nexus that once regulated the flow of time. They've crumbled, just like this place. Seris rose. This will not be a quick task, she said softly. But once the spires are restored, Cronus 7 may one day breathe free of the distortions. Kael met her gaze, weighing the reality of returning to the Bureau with this extraordinary revelation. Part of him wanted to call in the news of Seris's innocence, to exonerate the Phantom. But he also knew that, without immediate proof, he would meet nothing but disbelief and censure. And the truth might be lost again in bureaucratic cover-ups or centuries of confusion. Let me assist, Kael said at last, surprising even himself with his resoluteness. I'm an OIB agent, but what I've seen here transcends any order or protocol. I'll help you restore Cronus 7. Seris smiled, and even the Phantom's stern visage softened. We welcome your help, she answered. Thus began their odyssey across the broken expanses of Cronus 7. Over days and nights, if such terms meant anything on this distorted planet, they traveled through labyrinthine canyons and scaled precarious cliffs, guided by Seris's centuries-old knowledge of the planet's layout. Ruined spires jutted from the dust, each once an anchor for the delicate interplay of chronal energies beneath the surface. In the first spire, they found a battered control chamber with columns of intricate runes, similar to those in Seris's prison. Working together, Kael, Seris, and the Phantom deciphered the runic sequences, realigning them until a deep, resonant hum reverberated through the structure. Through it all, Cronus 7's battered environment slowly responded, ancient currents of time rippling across the planet's surface like a gentle wave. During these endeavors, Kael learned more of Seris's past. Millennia ago, she had been revered by the Forerunners, an ancient, advanced civilization that harnessed cosmic energies with a synergy never replicated by any who came after. They crowned her a Cronius sovereign, a custodian of temporal balance. Yet, when an unknown cataclysm threatened to warp reality, factions within the Forerunners blamed her. Fearful of her powers, they chained her in stasis, believing that removing her from the timeline would safeguard reality. Unfortunately, their solution was flawed, and their empire fell not long after. The knowledge of her innocence was lost amid the chaos. At the second spire, they discovered hidden passages leading to a sub-basement of swirling energies, corridors where time bled from one epoch to another. Ghostly images of the Forerunners walked those halls in endless repetition, illusions of the final days before everything collapsed. Seris's eyes glistened with sorrow as she watched the echoes of her people, half-remembered forms drifting in the gloom. There were once thousands of us, she whispered, voice trailing off. And in our ignorance, we turned on each other, fracturing the greatest empire the stars had known. With the Phantom's help, she reactivated the second nexus. A golden wave spread out from the spire, and the swirling illusions steadied, merging into the present in a calm swirl of light. As they approached the third spire, the planet's atmosphere became strangely serene, with swirling clouds parting to reveal patches of starry sky. Kael would often look up at those stars, thinking of the Bureau's vantage point. Part of him worried that a retrieval squad or a punitive force might appear at any moment. But so far, the quarantine field around Cronus 7 remained unbreached. In the third spire, they confronted a final challenge. The runic system was almost entirely destroyed, caved in by ancient seismic shocks. Without it, the alignment would remain incomplete, leaving Cronus 7 vulnerable to future distortions. For days, they sifted through rubble, searching for fragments that might be salvaged to reconstruct the nexus. Kael's chronovisor provided some assistance in detecting energies that once powered the runic mechanism. The Phantom used his deep knowledge of the Forerunner language to piece together inscriptions. Seris poured her own energy into reactivating the dormant nodes, though each attempt left her visibly drained. Finally, at the heart of the ruin, they uncovered a battered but intact runic disk. Seris placed her hands upon it, her eyes shimmering with that cosmic depth. "This is the final piece," she breathed. "With this, we can restore the spire's temporal flow." Under Seris's guidance, Kael and the Phantom fit the disk into a half-broken console. The surface lit up with a swirl of colors, runes springing to life across the room. Seris raised her arms, directing a wave of golden energy into the console. A deep vibration resonated through the spire, and beyond its walls, the planet's crust seemed to settle, as though relieved of a millennia-long ache. A brilliant column of light erupted from the top of the spire, shooting into the sky like a beacon. Similar beams glowed from the other two spires. For a moment, Cronus 7 was linked by ribbons of light, its battered form embracing a long-awaited restoration. Kael felt the planet exhale a sigh of relief. In the days that followed, the storms of temporal chaos lessened. Where once jagged fissures marred the land, gentle pulses of energy now filled them, weaving the timeline back together. Ancient illusions subsided into memory, and the swirling anomalies that had tormented Cronus 7 began to dissipate. During this time, Kael managed to contact Director Lys via the Aethalia's comm system, which had only recently started functioning properly amid the dissipating temporal interference. He reported, in carefully chosen words, that the threat of Cronus 7 had been neutralized, leaving out many specifics. He requested a dialogue between Seris and the Bureau, hoping that a peaceful resolution might be reached. To his relief, Director Lys's response was measured, if cautious. She acknowledged the Bureau's ignorance of Seris's true nature and expressed a willingness to send a diplomatic team, although the quarantine would technically remain in effect until they could verify the planet's stability. When the Bureau's vessel finally arrived, Kael greeted it alongside Seris and the Phantom on a newly stabilized plateau near the central spire. The ship, a hulking steel-gray dreadnought, hovered under swirling clouds that had lost much of their previous malevolence. Director Lys herself, in formal regalia, disembarked with a small entourage of agents and analysts. She approached cautiously, her gaze shifting from Kael to Seris, to the Phantom, then to the revitalized spires. Kael prepared for confrontation, but Lys slowly bowed her head in respect to Seris. "We came prepared for a conflict," she admitted quietly. "But your world seems at peace. Whatever was amiss appears to be corrected." Seris responded with a nod, her stance regal yet humble. "I bear no ill will toward the Bureau. I only wish to see the timeline protected, so no more worlds become victims of fear and misunderstanding." Over the next weeks, a tentative alliance began to form. Under Kael's guidance, and with Lys's grudging acceptance, the Bureau engaged in dialogue with Seris. Specialized scientists arrived to study the planet's slowly healing temporal field, while Seris helped them understand the Forerunner runes and technology. The Phantom, his identity partially declassified, was granted provisional amnesty, on the condition that his knowledge could be used to stabilize other anomalies that might lurk in the Orion sector. For Kael, this felt like the start of a new chapter, one that transcended old loyalties. He found himself torn between the demands of the Bureau and the higher calling of cosmic balance that Seris embodied. Over time, however, he recognized that bridging these realms was necessary. The Bureau needed to evolve, to accept the idea that not all ancient powers were malevolent, and that sometimes the only way forward was to rewrite the old narratives. One late evening, as Cronus 7's sky shimmered with the faint afterglow of auroras, relics of the planet's newly stable energy, Kael stood on the same plateau where he had landed the Aethalia. The battered infiltration craft rested at his back, its hull still marked by the planet's storms. A gentle breeze stirred the dust at his feet. From behind him, Seris approached, her form haloed by the violet hues of the sky. "You're leaving," she said, though it was more a statement than a question. Kael nodded, lighting a cigarette despite the swirling wind. "Director Lys wants me back at the Bureau. Diplomatic efforts are ongoing, but they need an agent to speak to the Council about what we accomplished here, and about you." He exhaled slowly, smoke curling into the air. "I won't lie, it'll be a tough sell, but I think they're beginning to understand the truth." Seris stepped closer, a soft warmth in her gaze. "Cronus 7 owes you much," she said. "You gave me the chance to reclaim my purpose, and you helped mend the timeline despite the risk. Kael shrugged, a hint of a wry smile on his lips. All I did was question an old order and follow the right leads. It's you and the Phantom who did the heavy lifting. At that moment, the Phantom emerged from the shadows, the half-mask now hanging at his belt. His expression was calmer, more hopeful. I'll remain to continue assisting Seris, he said. There's still much to rebuild, archives to restore, and the last vestiges of the Forerunner's knowledge to safeguard. Just promise not to vanish after leaving a flower in each vault, Kael teased, arching a brow. The Phantom's lips curled into a faint grin. I'll try a more direct approach next time. Their eyes met in mutual respect. Past enmities had yielded to a shared purpose, forging an unlikely camaraderie. Seris extended her hand, and Kael took it, feeling the lingering aura of cosmic energy that coursed through her veins. Farewell, she said softly. Know that you will always be welcome on Cronus 7. And if ever you feel the distortions again, if you sense anomalies in the timeline, find me. Kael gently squeezed her hand, nodding. Count on it. He released her and walked up the ramp into the Aethalia's hull. The engines hummed as the craft powered up, sending dust swirling behind him. In his final glance through the cockpit window, he saw Seris and the Phantom, side by side, gazing up at the departing ship under the newly placid skies of Cronus 7. As the Aethalia lifted off and soared into the stratosphere, Kael felt a pang of wistfulness. Despite the planet's harshness, it had become a place of revelation and new beginnings. Yet, duty called him to return, to report what he'd learned, and to hopefully usher in an era where the Bureau no longer reflexively imprisoned what it did not understand. Once beyond the atmosphere, Kael keyed in the codes to pass through the quarantine field. This time, the barrier parted without resistance, as if acknowledging that its long-standing purpose had changed. He guided the ship toward the faint glimmer of a Bureau rendezvous station, a solitary point of light in the emptiness of space. The next months became a whirlwind of briefings and heated debates. The Council, deeply entrenched in its traditions, met Kael's testimony with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. Some believed wholeheartedly in Seris's innocence. Others demanded proof or called for a renewed lockdown of Cronus 7. But with Director Liss's cautious endorsement and supporting data provided by the specialized teams that had landed on the planet, the tides slowly turned. Eventually, an official statement acknowledged that Seris Aelara was, in fact, a misunderstood guardian of the timeline, and that Cronus 7's anomalies had been stabilized thanks to her unique abilities. The Phantom's role was quietly reclassified, and the dreaded rogue infiltrator label gave way to independent operative assisting the Bureau under special circumstances. Though many protocols remained in flux, a cautious optimism spread through the Orion Intelligence Bureau. One evening, Kael found himself in the Bureau's upper observation deck, a silent corridor that offered panoramic views of the cosmos. He leaned against the railing, gazing out at the star-dappled void. Memories flooded his mind. The swirling vortex overhead, Seris's golden aura, and the moment her chains shattered. The Bureau was changing, he realized. Perhaps, in time, it would become a force of genuine understanding rather than blind enforcement. From behind him, Director Liss approached with quiet footsteps. Agent Voss, she said softly, standing beside him at the railing. The Council has concluded its inquiries. They've accepted the findings. Seris Aelara remains free, and Cronus 7 is officially recognized as a stabilized site. Kael offered a small, relieved smile. That's more than I hoped for. Liss nodded, her gaze drifting over the stars. There are still detractors, you know. Some within our ranks can't let go of the old narrative. But for now, we've done the right thing. Kael took a breath, letting the hush of space calm him. So what now? She turned to face him, features etched with thoughtful resolve. We move forward, Kael. There are more anomalies out there, more secrets from ancient civilizations that might be festering, waiting to erupt. The Bureau will need agents willing to look beyond dogma. Agents like you. He flicked the ghost of a grin. Well, I'm not the easiest agent to rein in, as you know. But I'm here. Liss nodded, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. We all change, Kael. That's part of the continuum. Thank you for helping us see the truth. Shortly thereafter, she departed down the corridor, leaving Kael alone with his thoughts. He surveyed the stars for a long time, letting their silent radiance anchor him. In his mind's eye, he pictured Seris on Cronus 7, quietly rebuilding a lost legacy. He thought of the Phantom, meticulously piecing together runic scripts that might well save the galaxy from future catastrophes. And he smiled. Though darkness still lurked in many corners of the Orion sector, and old fears could easily resurface, there was hope. Seris was free, no longer a forgotten prisoner of time, and with her liberation, the timeline's wounds were beginning to mend. The Phantom was no longer a solitary renegade, but an ally, forging a path of collaboration rather than stealth and sabotage. And Kael Voss, once just a chain-smoking agent with a penchant for rule-bending, had discovered a purpose that transcended departmental orders. In the years that followed, Cronus 7 became a place of cautious pilgrimage for scholars, agents, and scientists seeking to learn from Seris's wisdom, to understand the Forerunner's intricate knowledge of time. The planet's climate, once battered by raging storms, grew steadily calmer. The spires glowed gently at twilight, and the dust-laden winds carried whispers of what once was and what could be. With each passing month, remnants of the old illusions faded, replaced by tangible progress. Seris, for her part, grew in renown as a benevolent custodian of the timeline. Tales spread of her kindness and the cosmic insight in her gaze, though some rumors still portrayed her as an enigmatic, possibly fearsome being. The Phantom often appeared at her side, quietly helping interpret lost scripts or taking brief off-world trips to retrieve data. And always, in his wake, a single violet flower sometimes appeared, a reminder of his old signature, now transformed into a gesture of hope rather than an omen of infiltration. And so, in the grand tapestry of the galaxy's unfolding chapters, the story of Cronus 7 did not end in apocalypse, but in rebirth. Agent Kael Voss had freed the woman chained for centuries, and though he risked unleashing a temporal storm, that very storm paved the way for healing. The battered, desolate world became a beacon of enlightenment, reminding every starfarer that not all prisons are built to contain evil. Sometimes, they are constructed to cage misunderstood gifts. In that truth lay the seed of a brighter future, a future no longer shackled by the mistakes of the past. And for all those who dared to step beyond the known into uncharted domains of cosmic knowledge, Cronus 7 stood as a testament that even after centuries of darkness, hope and redemption could bloom, radiant and alive, like a violet flower resting upon the threshold of eternity.